My guest today is Michael Esfeld, the full professor of philosophy of science at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, where he's been for more than 20 years now. He's also a fellow of the National Academy of Germany, Leopoldina, and has recently become a member of the Board of Trustees of the Liberal Institute of Switzerland, and also a fellow of the Hayek Society of Germany. All in all, he is a professor of philosophy of science who majors on the definitions of liberalism, open society and freedom with a strong scientific background. He's also found to his cost that some of his ideas will not meet the test of the censors, even in his own profession. Michael, you're very welcome today.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation.
Michael, you've been in Switzerland for more than 20 years now. A lot of viewers of UK Column regard it as a paragon of freedom and an embodiment of the kind of Enlightenment liberalism that people feel they've lost in Germany, Britain, Austria, elsewhere. But although you've got full tenure at a Swiss university, you are already feeling the pinch of some kind of censorship and cold shouldering. First of all, tell us about your setting, what you appreciate about being in Lausanne and in Switzerland more generally, and how you have come to the position we'll be exploring, which is that the rule of law is under serious threat because of lack of courage.
Now, as you mentioned, Alex, I'm a philosopher of science. And when you've done your PhD, your postdoc, you apply all over the places. And so I had the luck to be appointed in Lausanne 21 years ago, when they founded a program for science students in philosophy also. So my job partially is to teach science students some basics in philosophy of science, and then the usual philosophy program. And as you may know, the Lake Geneva, it's a nice region, and Lausanne University, the working conditions are good, and they are still good. I mean, they are still better than in other places. So I had no reason to apply for other jobs since I've been here. And I mean, my work all the time was all over the period of I did my PhD in 1994, so that's nearly 30 years ago now. And that was on Hobbes, and it was on the relationship between Hobbes' philosophy of nature, or philosophy of science, his anthropology, and his political philosophy. So the intersection between natural science and human sciences, humanities, was always the focus of my work, and I always argued against scientism. So all what I say now and what has met with a lot of reservations or opposition is what I said all the time, and for which I got a professorship, was elected fellow of the National Academy, etc. So nothing has changed, I would say. I still say the same thing. And the only thing I do is that I continue to say the same thing, and also I continue to apply it to the present situation. So my first philosophy book that I read when I was about 15 years old was Popper on the Open Society and its enemies. And I still regard Popper as one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, both in philosophy of science and in political philosophy. And all the points, I mean, there's nothing original in me. You find them in Popper, about natural science and its limits, and about the political implications.
Let us dive straight into that, because I wanted to explore some definitions of terms with you, Michael, and I know that a significant slice of our audience will have pricked up their ears when you mentioned Karl Popper. The one thing they may know about them, and I don't mean to be patronizing, but it's just a reflection of the media environment, established and new media. The one thing they will know about Karl Popper is that he was tutor to George Soros, and when they hear you mentioning the Open Society, which you mention I think quite frequently in your high-profile article for the Brownstone Institute recently for an international audience, they may think, is Michael Esfeld endorsing the man who gave the world George Soros? So perhaps you'd better tease out for us what Karl Popper's philosophy of the Open Society was, and how actually he was quite opposed to turning religion into a science, scientism.
Yes, so his view of the open society is a society in which you respect other people's lifestyle, religion, etc. You respect their self-determination to the extent that they respect some basic rules. So the basic rule is that everybody has the same rights and has the same right to self-determination, and that implies an obligation to respect other people. So this goes back to Kant mainly, when Kant says that every human being, every person must always be treated as an end in itself and never as a means, and never as a mere means to an end. So this is this Kantian framework based on human freedom and respecting of human freedom. And what Popper showed is that science, scientific theory, scientific discoveries presuppose human freedom, presuppose exchange, free exchange among scientists, etc. So you have a clear link between science and what is called the rule of law in an open, free society.
And that takes us straight on to the second tricky term that we have to define, the rule of law. Now, David Scott and Brian Gerrish and I have, in the most recent episode of A Dissident's Guide to the Constitution, which you can find from ukcolumn.org and then go to series, we have done a whole episode on the rule of law and the slippery definition of it. In fact, we entitled the episode Rule of Whose Law, because we felt that in the English-speaking world and now globally, a trick is being played with this term, and it's being held up as a false opposition to democracy or the will of the people. We have an additional complication here in that you do your work in German, where the term is der Rechtsstaat, the state bound by law, or constitutional state, or constitutional republic, you also use in your English writing. Yeah. I don't think it means quite the same as we understand in English by the rule of law. Perhaps a better translation, a goodwill translation of what you mean by der Rechtsstaat would be limited government in a more English-speaking phrase. But how has this term developed? Because I think it's narrowing, actually. I see that the Dutch used to just copy from German this phrase, and they called it der Rechtsstaat. Then, maybe inspired by the German secret services, who call themselves protectors of the Constitution, they recently said they were they were protecting the Demokratische Rechtsstaat, which is a narrowing of the phrase. And now, this year, they've invented a new phrase all of their own, which is the Demokratische Rechtsorde, the democratic order of law, which is about trust in institutions, apparently. So how has the definition turned and changed over the centuries?
Yeah, there's a lot of abuse done with the term democracy here. But let's start with rule of law. Now, the question is, which law do you mean? And if you say rule of law, it cannot mean the positivist law imposed by states. I mean, then it would be trivial. Then every dictatorship, the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, etc., would count as rule of law, because there was a leader and they issued laws. So there was a legislative and they respected those laws, whatever they were. So if these were laws of discrimination against Jews or against religious minorities or whatever, then that would be, but that can't be a rule of law. So when you speak of rule of law, you mean natural law. Now, there's a long history of natural law going back to the ancient Greeks, but it comes down to natural law in the sense a law that derives from human nature. And then we are back to the point that we had before, freedom, the free will, that is human nature. Why? Because look, take an example from science. You have a cat chasing, torturing a mouse before catching and eating the mouse. Now, you cannot criticize the cat, its instinctive behavior, or do you may be morally appalled. But when a human being does the same thing, you criticize them, because even if we have certain instincts, certain sense impressions, certain needs, certain desires, we can reflect upon them. Is that the right thing to do? We can ask this question, and therefore we are subject to justification. The Greeks called that logon didonai. You have to give reason for what you do. So you're always in a network of reasons and justifications. And rule of law refers to that. So the law, the basic law, of course, is to respect other people. That's the natural law. Respect their freedom, respect their right to deliberation, which also implies the obligation that they have to justify their actions. And if they torture other people, for instance, then apparently this is not justifiable. So the measure here, the law, is the natural law that respects the freedom rights of every person. You can go back, for instance, to Kant. So the German tradition always refers to Kant. When Kant defines law, he means law, Naturrecht, natural law, as that law which makes the freedom of each person compatible with the freedom of every other person. So when the law interdicts when they infringe upon, and that should be, and rule of law means that this law rules. Now, there's a good thing about, I like more the English word rule of law, and in German I translated it into Rechtsordnung, because we don't have the state as yet in here. What we need for a rule of law is a judge. So suppose we sit in the room now, Alex, not via Zoom, but face to face, and you start smoking. And I feel offended by your smoking. And you say, well, I have the freedom, it's my house. Okay, if it's your place, I can say, well, I have the freedom to walk out. But suppose we are in a public place somehow. And then I complain. And now we may get into an argument, and that may become, I mean, not you and me, but let's say, so some people may get into an argument. And before they resort to violence, they better appeal to a judge. So some neutral instance that judges the case whether someone infringed upon the freedom and the self-determination of another person. So to implement the rule of law, we need a judiciary system. We need something like what in English is called common law. We need judges in the first place. We have somehow to make an agreement, or we must have some system, some mechanism in place such that when someone feels that someone interferes with their rights, they can appeal to a judge, and the judge is somehow respected and their judgments are somehow implemented. But we don't need a state for that, okay? And we don't need a legislation for that. We need, when a case comes up, so when someone feels offended by someone else, they must have the possibility to appeal to a judge. But the judge enters only if one party somehow feels offended. There's no prejudge. You don't need a state with a legislative for that imposes all sorts of things, and you don't need a central state government for that to start with. We may need it, we may come back to that, then we get to republicanism, etc. But rule of law basically means that the law is the respect of the basic rights of everybody, and the rule of law is that rule which guarantees these rights and implements them and settles conflicts in the case there is a conflict. And we have a long tradition of in England, common law, in Ireland, common law, the Roman law of that.
I think it was Lord Denning who summed up the common law understanding of the rule of law when he said, "Be you never so high, the law is above you." He, sitting as one of the highest judges in the land, acknowledged that the law was superior to him. And certainly in our part of the world, all the Germanic and Celtic tribes have a long history of having dispute resolution by appealing to juries and judges well before there was any state or legislature. So Exactly. You're clearly borne out there, which helps to refute the idea that the rule of law can be waived in front of disenchanted plebs these days, to be told we have these institutions, they're democratic, so you must like it or lump it, because it was done in your name anyway. I think there's one more term that we have to bottom out there, because some of your fellow authors at the very interesting Brownstone Institute, who are bringing these issues to wide attention in the US and the world now, a term that they're zooming in on as part of the problem now is this idea of the general good or public good. A well-known term in its French-speaking past as the bien public, and if you go back to Rousseau, it claims to rest on this idea of la volonté générale, the general or universal will. And if you look more closely, elitists like Rousseau ended up claiming that this was not the same as the volonté de tous, not the will of every man, because that was a rabble, but certain rarefied souls could rise above the fray of public of partisan interest and could determine kind of in the ether what the real people or the real self-interest of the people was, and embody that as something else. And that now is coming back with a vengeance in the USA, Britain, elsewhere, in countries that thought we didn't have this, what we thought of as continental totalitarian problem, because we're being told we must limit your freedom because of the general good. This is the logos, the reason, which is now being furnished to us, but it's a hollow and fake one. So how do we go about dismantling that?
And go back to Popper. I mean, that's exactly the point Popper made in his The Open Society and its enemies. These are the enemies of the open society because they don't respect the freedom of everybody. That's not the same right of everybody anymore, but someone defines. I mean, it's clear, volonté de tous, the will of everybody makes no sense because you will never have unanimity. Okay, so you have some all goods are scarce. Now you have to distribute them, and you won't agree on what does everybody share. So someone pretends that they can define what the volonté générale is or the common good. And you always have to be suspicious when someone says that, because they take this to overrule the rule of law. Now they say, oh, it's not the case that you absolutely have some freedom rights, such as the right to express your view, the right to choose your diet, the right to choose the place where you live, when you make agreement with a landlord to rent a place, etc. The right to open your business and sell your goods, or open a pub and receive people and serve them food and drink. To the extent that they agree on the price, etc. And someone comes, oh no, if you serve this dish, this is against the common good. If you express certain views, they may hurt the feelings of certain other people, so you must not do this, etc. So the common good is an empty phrase because it cannot be defined. I mean, the definition is circular. It's the good. It can't be the good for everybody, because some people will always say that they don't find this good, they don't like it. And so you need, and that's where this elite comes in, someone who fixes what the common good is. And then they claim to have a mandate for that or whatever. But the thing is very easy. Of course, we can talk about common goods and the like, to the extent that we respect the basic rights of everybody. So, of course, say water is a common good. You need water, and someone will supply you with water. Of course, obviously, water is a common good, and there will be an agreement how to supply water, what price to pay for it, etc. But it's not that someone can impose up you in the name of the common good and say, now we rationalize water, some central planning or something like that.
Do you think that part of the trick that was played came through the 19th century developments in English liberalism? You've got Bentham, utilitarian founder, J.S. Mill, and then later in the century, the likes of Rhodes and Lord Milner, all saying more courageously than the last throughout the century, well, we can't have everyone wanting his own way in this modern world. Chaps like us are going to have to decide what's best. And in its most pseudo-civilized form, you could say that this is enunciated as, well, you have a right to do what you want if you want the things that a well-bred Englishman wants. You know, that we can tolerate a world in which people think like us, and those who don't are superfluous to requirements. That's a very dramatic extreme of, but it was said by a lot of these English and German figures at the time. Or in a more moderate form, we're going to have to re-educate them. It was done, of course, very subtly with a velvet glove around the iron fist. But is that where the switch of values took place, so that the term liberal has ended up, especially in America now, being a term of abuse rather than the tradition that you embody?
Yes. I think you're right, and that is related to the development of nation states and imperialism, so the 19th century imperialism. I mean, there's a very good side to the 19th century and to Great Britain, because they abolished slavery. That came from England, that slavery was abolished, and I mean, with military force prevented that slaves were transported from Africa to America, etc. So that's a very good thing. So you should also say a good thing about 19th century England and liberalism. But then it deviated. It deviated with a state who become not a state of protection of right, but a welfare state looking after the welfare of people. Then you got utilitarianism, the idea that somehow you could define a common good for most of the people, but then you will still ask, what is with the minority? Don't they have any rights? So do they have? They still have their human rights, and each human being is unique. So if someone says, okay, for the good of the majority, we have to sacrifice your life, something obviously has gone wrong. So utilitarianism, also, it's fine to the extent that you respect the basic rights of everybody. Well, they don't, etc., and then that's where it's not fine, and where it goes astray.
Your host society, Switzerland, seems to have canonized this, because one of the most trenchant observations of Switzerland I ever read is that wherever you are in Switzerland, you are a minority in some way. You may be one of the minority speakers of your language within your canton. You may be a minority religiously within your canton or even your municipality. And it's a much more armed peace than people think in Switzerland, not just pre-1848, when, like the rest of continental Europe, there were all kinds of insurrections and civil wars going on, but even post-1848, when Switzerland reinvented itself as the international neutral state of peace. It's very much a place where people are asserting their rights vigorously, if only with words and law, against others, isn't it?
Well, I think it's mostly the pluralism that you mentioned. There are a lot of languages here, religions, etc. So that prevents a central state from coming up. Now, if you're not happy with the people in your community for whatever reason, so it can be very simple. There are communal taxes, so you may find that your taxes are too high in your village, you move to the next village or the next canton. So you have competition, and that's the important thing, I guess. So if you say, okay, so that's what we have, Western speaking Switzerland, the French speaking part where I am is more statist, more etatism than the German speaking part. So you get the people saying, yeah, okay, we have to raise taxes and etc. for this or that good. And then some people will say, okay, well, why should I live in this place? And then they can just walk to another place. So I think that's the important thing about Switzerland, that you have alternative options. You don't have to emigrate to the United States, but you can go to the next village. They do it in another way. And you can't impose the central state because there's not a common language, not a common, what you would call nation building, etc. So that gives you alternatives, that gives you possibilities to if you don't like something, to choose some other way, and that limits state power, of course, because they know that the minority, even if they have a majority decision and say it's all democratic, they can vote with their feet and just walk away, and then they are in trouble.
They have in common with the Dutch this idea that they are a Willensnation, a nation which came into being by saying, we don't want arbitrary rule, we're going to become a republic. The Netherlands is de facto in many ways still a republic, more than some of the other monarchies. And also this freedom of movement and voting with your feet, which is much more associated with the USA, but which does happen in the Netherlands and Switzerland with shorter distances. People say, I don't like this provincial tax or bossing around. There are other countries, including, in my perception, Germany, where people have much more the attitude of, I'm being abused here, but it is my Heimat. You know, my ancestors grew up here. Why should I give it up? A strong sentiment of that kind exists around the United Kingdom as well. But you are perhaps less favorably disposed towards that. You might say that it's inviting tyranny over you.
No, I mean, this feeling exists also in Switzerland, and I would be skeptical about the word Willensnation. My perception rather is that they live together faute de mieux. There is no viable alternative. So look at this French-speaking part of Switzerland, Lausanne, Geneva, etc. Culturally, they all look to France and regard France as a model. But if you ask someone, okay, so suppose some Macron becomes something Napoleon-like and says, okay, the French nation and all French-speaking parts, people should be integrated into France, and he starts some sort of campaign to conquer Western Switzerland. He would meet immediately with resistance, because all the French-speaking people would say, okay, culturally France may be admirable, but we definitely don't want to live in the French state. And we don't like, say, these German-speaking Swiss people. They are rural, they are not well cultivated, etc. So there are some reservations, but at least economically, etc., we are better off with them. They leave us more freedom than if we were France. And so you can do this the same turn now with the with the German-speaking part or the Italian-speaking part. The alternatives are worse. So no one will, or not, most people will not somehow say Switzerland, at least this is my perception. I mean, I'm coming as an outsider. This is the nation, etc., as you have it in France or in Germany. And that's the problem about Germany, what you mentioned. You don't have, in principle, you also have a state which is built from below, but de facto not. De facto, you have a central state. There's one that the tax is always the same. They make the same policy. They even education, etc., is no longer in the states. They had these mock during the COVID regime. They had these showings of where they called all the regional leaders, etc., the minister, president, etc. But this was predetermined. And I mean, there was one way to impose a central rule there. So you don't have what you have in Switzerland, this possibility of going somewhere else. And in Switzerland, you have it, as I mentioned, because of the difference in language and culture, etc., which you cannot just gloss over. As you could in Germany, you have one language, one nation since the 19th century, etc. And this creates or favors the central state, which erases pluralism. And then you're back. If you want to leave, you would have to leave the whole country, etc., emigrate to the United States or emigrate to Switzerland. What happens these days? A lot of people who have trouble in Germany emigrated to Switzerland, and in former days, a lot of people emigrated to the United States, etc.
I know some Germans who live just a few hundred yards over the border in Schaffhausen or somewhere so that they can home educate, for example. And with the Dutch and Belgians and Luxembourgers, you get this. People live just over the border in another Benelux country or France or Germany for lower taxes or better schooling. Or it does happen in Europe more than people think. Without getting too sentimental or romantic, we could even say that the national anthems of the various German-speaking countries reveal a thing or two. The Austrians start by praising the beauty of their land, so the land has primacy over them. The Germans think back to 1848 and their assertion of liberalism, and they start by asking for Einigkeit und Recht und Freiheit in that order. Let's be one unitary state, although it's, as you say, there's a show of federalism. And then, secondly, we demand law. And thirdly, we demand liberty. Whereas the French want liberty, equality, fraternity.
Yeah, and that is in part a result of the Einigkeit, of the centralism, which erases pluralism, which tends to, if you have power concentrated in one place in one hand, that tends to abuse.
Whereas the Schweizer Psalm, the Swiss national anthem, at least since 1961, goes to the other extreme and talks about the God-given rights of the individual and doesn't really mention the state at all. It mentions the individual relationship with his creator and his inalienable rights.
Yeah. I mean, and that's all right. I mean, the state comes in as Rechtsstaat if it comes in as all to implement and guarantee the rule of law. But these days, that's difficult. Also in Switzerland, because Switzerland may be better off than the neighboring countries, but with all these trends, they don't resist to these trends. So they come here as well, but in a somehow mitigated way.
I like reporting on UK Column about Switzerland and, in fact, the Netherlands, how, because of their unique constitutional past and their republicanism, they do import the evils of the Western beast, we can call it, but they always have to give it a native twist, and it gets watered down in some way. And often from province to province, even from town to town, the results are different. Whereas in Germany, or I'm sad to say the UK, or certainly France, they would be imposed uniformly and rubber stamped by officials from top to bottom of the country. Before we get off geographical considerations, I have to ask, since you grew up in the late Cold War in West Berlin, do you think that made you more perceptive of the boundaries of liberty? I mean, after all, you could see the communist world, and you were talking about alternatives earlier. I guess a lot of mentors in your youth would say, young man, if you don't like what you see, just look over there, and that's the alternative.
Exactly. I mean, you could literally see the Berlin Wall and what was going on beyond the wall, and that people were shot dead when they tried to flee, etc. So you had a very clear alternative, and that's part of the problem that we have today, because now go back to say 1968, 1969. If we mention the coronavirus waves, you had the Hong Kong flu at that time, and from an epidemiological point of view, I mean, as far as all the data are concerned, the Hong Kong the flu was worse in those days, but it would have been impossible to think of imposing a lockdown or anything like that, because everybody would say, but look, listen, that's what they do beyond the war. I mean, the state, I mean, the the discourse, if you want to say, the narrative was that we in the West, we are free, and look beyond the wall, it's the Soviet tanks, and if the people there go on the street, then the Soviet tanks come and shoot at them, and it's a military dictatorship, a totalitarian state, etc. And we are different. And now we don't have this alternative. I mean, China is far away. Eastern Europe has been liberated. Russia is somehow an authoritarian country, but not, and that was not like the Soviet Union. So we lack this contrast point, and I think that's a very important aspect why this what happens now can happen, because there's no obvious alternative to contrast it with. So people in Eastern Germany often say, well, we are going back to this is the DDR 2.0, so this goes back to the so-called German Democratic Republic, and we see it revived, etc. But that's back in the memory. So most people who live today are younger than me, and they don't remember those days actively. They were not born or have been small children, etc. So the point of lacking an obvious contrast is part why this Western narrative of the free Western world could break down so easily.
One of the two articles that you have written so far for the Brownstone Institute talks about COVID as one of the areas, perhaps the area in which postmodernism has already arrived. And we'll concentrate on the other article you've written, but in that COVID postmodernism article, you posit that it is the presence of fiat money which allows COVID to be really rolled out in the absence of any real basis for it, because state force, state incentives reach infinity when you're using fake money. You also say at the end of your book, we'll be talking about your new book later, but you have this sentence in the German edition: Wenn das Gesundheitssystem nicht in staatlicher Hand läge, dann könnte es das Übel, das wir zurzeit erleben, nicht geben. If the health system wasn't in state hands, we would not be seeing the evils we're currently witnessing, which may surprise people, because foreigners to Central Europe, outsiders to Central Europe, might think that the various German-speaking countries are fiscally responsible. They might also think that it's only us in Britain and Canada, for example, that have a state healthcare system. You're saying that de facto Central Europe does as well.
Yes, so slowly. Now, you always have two things. You have an ideology. So we have the scientist and postmodern ideology, which goes back to Rousseau somehow, but you mentioned the common good. So someone poses an allegedly common good and says this is imposed by moral or science and whatever, and you have the so-called die Überbau in Hegelian or Marxist terms, and these terms are right. And then Unterbau, so some real things, some real power. And the real power you have is the welfare state, which seeks to, under the pretext of protecting people, to enlarge its power. And those two came together. And now the welfare state, which is at some stage in the early 1970s, could not be financed by real money, by money that was covered by some real goods like gold, because they needed more money. And then they started printing money. And the COVID regime, I said, would have not been possible without the ability of the state to print money as they wish. So they enlarged M2, the quantity of money, by 40%, which is enormous, just to bail out everybody, because no one, if you should shut down your business, I mean, you have to weigh the pros and cons while shutting down your business. So suppose you think it protects you from a virus, but you get into other trouble. So someone has to pay for that. And if they can just print money, then they can pay for it, and you don't see the consequences. You will see them. We started seeing them through inflation, but you don't see them immediately. And that instrument of power the state must have, otherwise they could not do the lockdowns. They could not do the vaccine mandates and impose you certain medical treatment without a state-controlled health system. Now, suppose you had a free health system, then you would choose, I mean, you should have a health insurance, of course. And before we had in Switzerland compulsory health insurance, I read that 98% of the people had a health insurance. They already had it, of course. And the 2% you had who didn't have, if they fell ill, of course, you could finance that. If 2% of the population don't, you won't let them die if they are ill. So what did
In
this
fact, just to interrupt on that, in the Netherlands, we have a Bible Belt that represents 2 or 3% of the population, which on principle isn't insured. And that works out in principle, in practice, by people going to the deacons of their church if they're uninsured and have a high health bill.
Yeah. So somehow this is done without compulsion, because there's some, of course, you would help people out that are in need. You don't need a state for that. So anyway, what happened when Switzerland at the end of the 90s imposed compulsory health insurance? So they defined, the state said, okay, this is the health insurance that you need. And they set a catalog, what is in there and what is out. So for instance, you made some people are fans of some sort of alternative medicine that is out. So the state imposes what you need in insurance and what is covered. And then but what happened is that the contribution for this insurance, the cost just doubled or tripled without any achievement. But this, of course, then made it possible for the state to say, okay, now we offer you for free these COVID tests and these vaccines. We pay for that. Okay, and then it made the second step possible. Now it becomes mandatory for crazy mandatory. You're not allowed, etc. If we didn't have this, of course, I mean, pharmaceutical industry is welcome to make innovation, so they may invent vaccines or whatever, but then they have to convince people that first these things are safe, that these things are effective, and then they are liable. So if someone buys this product, so if you go into a supermarket and you buy some food and the food is not good and you fall ill, etc., you can sue the supermarket or the producer of the food that they sold things which are harmful to your health. It's again the issue of rule of law, and you have certain rights, and now they cheated you, and when they don't assume liability, there's a judge, you can sue them. Now what happened in this case is that the state just can, if they have a state-controlled health system, and they do in Switzerland as well as in the United Kingdom. In Switzerland, everybody there's compulsory contribution. So if you don't pay for your health insurance, you end up in the last resort, you end up in prison, in the same way as if you don't pay your taxes, at the end of the day, they will imprison you. And so then the state can define what is good for your health and can impose it on you. And that's part of the problem, or that is the problem. So you have the two things. The only thing you need, the Unterbau, some state power which can impose in the name of common good whatever they want on you. And now they have the power and they want to use the power. And then comes in the ideology. Of course, come in economic interests. So if you run a business and have to convince customers, that's a hard job. It's better you just bribe or convince some politician that you work for the common good, so that the politician will bail you out in case of failure, like with banks. And the even better thing is to say, okay, you think it's necessary for the well-being of the population, so the politician buys your stuff with taxpayers' money, imposes it on the people, and you are not even liable. That's guaranteed profit without any risk, of course. And then you have the ideology which comes in and says this or that is good. And that's how they come together, and how we end up in the situation where we are now, which I call really actually existing postmodernism. So in German you said real existierender Sozialismus. So the thing was, you had Marxism, you had a certain ideology which said that, roughly speaking, if everybody contributes to his abilities, then everybody will get their needs satisfied, which obviously can't work, because my needs are much more than what I want is much more than what I'm able to produce, okay? So, and then you got this implemented, so you got the actually existing socialism, and they had to implement it via a totalitarian state and the Gulag, okay? So you have a postmodern ideology which says that everybody lives more or less, can live in their own reality. There's no universal reason, there are no universal rights. There's my feeling and there's your feeling, and we live each in our own reality. But the problem is that we somehow socially interact, we compete, we want to have the same goods, so we clash. And if there's no universal reason, then it's just a question of power. who determines what is the common good, what is the reality. That's what we've seen in these COVID days, that are called as actually existing postmodernism. So the state, via in Germany, this is called fact checkers in the official media, they define what the facts are, okay? And then you go to court, okay? You say, okay, I have, that what happened. There are a lot of actual court cases. So they said, my children fall ill because they had to wear a mask compulsory. I got a vaccination because I fell ill. And then the judge rules and says, okay, the state, the government has determined via the official institutions, such as the Robert Koch and the Paul Ehrlich Institute in Germany, that there are no adverse effects of the vaccines. So you can't sue them. Your complaint is rejected out of hand, because these are the facts, and the facts are what the authority states that the facts are. And that's this postmodernism. You lose the universal reason, the independent, the skepticism, the independent way of checking facts. You are no longer allowed to seize a judge which hears all the sides. So some of those who complained, they were even denied a court hearing, because a court hearing cannot take place because there's a dangerous virus as the state has established, etc., or the claim is obviously wrong because science has established this, and then this is rejected out of hand, even without hearing the parties and even without calling in independent experts. So you see the total corruption that comes with this postmodernism, because what a fact is what the authority says is a fact.
We see this term Staatsgewalt, state violence or government compulsion, as perhaps the key of your insight in various domains now, because you've described to us the house of postmodernism, that its Unterbau, its bottom story, its ground floor, is that you're forced to pay the taxes and the health insurance. A nice proof of that, by the way, is that I think 6 years ago now, UK Column did a specialist symposium on the undoing of the public nature of the British NHS, and all the speakers told us that the one thing we would keep, we developed differently from the Bismarckian healthcare model, because it's universalized and goes through the central treasury, not through any kind of employers or other associations. The one thing that the government would keep would be forcing us to pay the insurance, and that insurance would be disbursed by the one public remaining part of the NHS, namely the trusts, the local parts of the NHS that bought your treatment for you. So in fact, you've got the two things there. We define the public good and we force you to pay the taxes. Yeah. Very, very interesting and applicable to COVID and to various other kinds of tyranny here, because it applies to the law as well, because the postmodern house of law, you could say, which ends up with the abuses you've just described. Perhaps we're a little more protected from it in the common law jurisdictions because we have disclosure. We force the prosecuting case to prove all its assertions, rather than make a written or verbal argument to a judge, maybe via Zoom these days, that experts have already established this, so it's not contested. So the core of the core in both areas is Staatsgewalt, state compulsion to accept that this is a fact or pay this money.
Yeah, that's it.
You encapsulate
the problem.
That.
You don't have, and that's why you need an independent judiciary. I mean, on the paper, they could do hearings, and if the pressure goes up, they will do, but they must not do so. And even in Germany, there was a judge who did this, who called it independent experts, and then ruled that a certain mask mandate at school was harmful. The judge was suspended and is put on trial now himself for abuse of law, because he made a judgment which goes against the state order and against what the state authority established as facts. Of course, no judge will follow this example if then they are suspended and put on trial themselves.
You have been put on trial in a way, haven't you, by your colleagues? Just please show us your book, which has come out. Land ohne Mut.
This is a German book, and it is about. I mean, the subtitle that's mine. It's an instruction or suggestion, an Anleitung. It's instruction is a bit harsh.
Perhaps directions.
How to get back to science and the rule of law. And
directions to return to science and the rule of law.
Directions to
and
return.
Ironically enough. It's called Land ohne Mut.
The publisher said we need a title which catches the eye of the public. So they said country without land, without courage. Okay, and that's quite right, because The problem is that most people lack the courage to apply their own judgment and say, hey, that's not all right. Who are you to impose me a certain medical treatment? Who are you to impose me that I have to close down my business? I mean, if everybody who comes in does this voluntarily, I don't force anyone, and everybody is welcome, of course, to close down their business, to go themselves into lockdown, and we'll help them. They may wear masks, etc., but they must not impose this on other people, etc. And I mean, what happened? I mean, this started with this the German National Academy, Leopoldina, you mentioned before, has become an instrument of the state. So they betrayed science. They issued such ridiculous things as a proof of the absolute scientific necessity of the lockdown. That was for the second lockdown in Germany in winter 2020, when the Merkel government came under pressure. I mean, then people said, well, the first lockdown, we had one lockdown. Why do we need a second one? And there was no evidence, etc. And then the academy helped the government out, which is by ridiculous scientific proofs which don't meet any standards of I mean, any first-year bachelor student could see that this was pure propaganda. And then I protested to that, and naive as I were, I thought, I mean, many people would sign up. So I wrote a letter to the president of the academy and said, well, please, that's not your job. Your job is not to help the government out, but to foster science and enlightenment of the public. And then I thought, I mean, the number of colleagues in the academy would sign up, but nearly no one was prepared to sign up. And then the letter got into public, and that got then me into trouble. And I got nasty journal commentaries that I'm somehow a Nestbeschmutzer, how you did translate that.
A looter of the nest, a fouler of the nest.
Yeah, that was in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, etc. And then we had the local, perhaps I find this, the local paper here, because then some medical professors attacked me and said, well, there's a philosopher spreading fake news about COVID and vaccination. And then the local paper made the headline, Michael Esfeld, the rebellious professor who embarrassed the university, okay? Michael Esfeld, le prof rebelle qui embarrasse l'Union. So that's something like, what do you have in the UK? You have the Sun and
yeah, we call these the red tops, and this 24 Heures, it's also a red top, so it's exactly equivalent, a tabloid.
Tablet paper, and then they, yeah. Okay, and they were appalled. They said that's not all right. So you see here the whole story, and the thing is that the tablet paper criticized the university for doing what the university should do, namely allowing a debate.
Yes, the headline there is that the university calls into question its immense freedom. Immense freedom suggests, of course, dangerous.
Yeah, of course, that university allows, and they did. I mean, the University of Lausanne, I mean, they had to implement all the government regulations, of course, but I mean, I was free to speak out. I mean, I was, of course, not free to speak to break the rules or to criticize my employer, which I never did. But I mean, in the Kantian sense that the public use of your reason is always free, that was respected. Der öffentliche Gebrauch der Vernunft, it says Kant, muss immer frei sein. That's the only way to achieve progress, whereas the private use of reason, privé in the sense of when you have a working contract with an employer, of course, you have to respect the conditions of the contract. So you're limited in your use of reason, but publicly you can speak out. So in the Kantian time, the example was religion, so that some teacher of religion, if they were hired to teach a certain religion, then of course they had to teach what the church expected from them, but nevertheless they were free in public to suggest improvements, to criticize what was going on. So in the same sense, in Prussia at the time, they were obliged to pay taxes, etc., and to obey the orders. But, says Kant, the öffentliche Gebrauch der Vernunft, the public use of reason has always to be free. The citizen, the public, the members of the public always have the right to criticize the government, to make suggestions for improvement, etc. They don't have the right to take to arms and to violence, of course, but they have the right to always speak out in public. And that right today is no longer respected by, for instance, the media. when you then get defamed or so. So in this case of what we just had, this tablet newspaper, so the tablet newspaper was all right in the sense, at least they gave me the possibility to reply. So they asked me some questions, and then I said, I want you to print exactly my answers. You can say if they are too long, etc., but you print this exactly, so you don't cut off what you... And they did so. So in this case of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which is something like the Times in England, and what used to be a highly respected newspaper, they refused. And I said, okay, that's a defamation, what you did, Netzbeschmutzer, etc. It was just a heap of insults, etc. So I write a letter, a reader's letter to the editors, in which I pointed out that as a philosopher of science, it is my job to criticize scientific claims if they are used in a normative way to impose certain actions on people. That's just my job. That's the job of a philosopher since Socrates, to look critically. So I'm just doing my job. Come on. I may be wrong, etc., but I'm just doing my job. And they refused even to print a letter to the editors. So they violated even such as basic rule as you have to give the other side if they do it. And I mean, there was nothing insulting.
The old principle, audietur et altera pars.
Yeah,
let the other side be heard.
Yeah, that's not done anymore. So the recent thing I learned is that this book must not be presented at the Frankfurt Book Fair. So the editor Achgut was cancelled, and the reason is, this is the focus we have now, that they are cancelled is that some other publisher and authors who present their books at that book fair may feel offended if they see a book claiming, I mean, if the title is that it's the direction to go back to science and rule of law, so the implicit claim is we have lost science and the rule of law, and they may feel offended by that. And another book by a highly qualified, competent physician, Gunther Frank, was also banned because Gunther Frank claims that the state committed a crime. So he wrote the book with the same editor, Das Staatsverbrechen, claiming that if the state, for instance, imposes medical treatments such as these vaccinations on people without telling them that they are not well tested, they only have conditional approval, so they do not leave freedom of choice to the people, that's a crime. And it's obviously a crime. So I remember some professor of ethics saying that they are, of course, open and they want a critical discourse and they respect the open society. And then someone asked them and say, okay, would you invite this physician to speak? And said, of course, no, you must not question the government, of course. That's beyond the limit of the open discourse. So you have the same here. Of course, they want an open discourse, so you can choose, for instance, if you get your mandatory vaccination through Johnson & Johnson or BioNTech, but if you say that mandatory vaccinations are wrong or something like that, or it's wrong that the state imposes it, of course, you must not say. That is beyond the limits of what can be held as discourse. That's so ridiculous. Now go back to Eastern Germany. Of course you had freedom of speech. Of course they even had elections or so. There was a liberal party, a Christian Democratic Party, even a German National Party, on the condition that they formed a bloc with the Communist Party. But they could somehow, and sometimes they could bring in the Christian Democrats put in some opposition for religious reasons, etc. But they all had to avow to anti-fascism. And I mean, what a fascist was more or less everybody who somehow contradicted that that communism is scientifically proven. So you can just apply this word to word. Of course, you have to adhere to the official narrative, and then, of course, within this we have a discussion. We have some choice. But that's exactly the freedom of speech which you have in every totalitarian state.
You had the same triad. The same triad in the communist bloc is the one which is now being touted here in the Netherlands by the AIVD, the premier intelligence agency, as I recently covered, because they actually show a pyramid, although they invert it, pointing downwards, showing that the plebs, whom they put at the top, so it's not so obvious, have to have trust in the official narrative through the pillars of state-funded science, state-funded education, and state-funded broadcasting or media, these three, which you, at the end of the conclusion of your book, talk about. And you talk about this system as having been irreparably damaged in practice because it leads to hubris which is the same as superbia. The classical and Christian understanding is this is the key sin, the mother of all other sins, the pride, which says I can determine everything in the world, which you also say is corruption. And this corruption comes about because dreamers, thinking about this common good, unattainable norm, have said, well, if we force the plebs to pay for the right thinking, because media, education, science is all about how to perceive the world, then we can use our state force. And you've hit the bedrock of that. Particularly ironic, given that the Frankfurt Book Fair is not historically the Frankfurt Book Fair. It was the Leipzig Book Fair, wasn't it? They moved it from East Germany because they thought if we leave it in Leipzig, professors of philosophy and physicians will be cancelled by an overbearing state and not be able to sell their books there.
Yeah, but it's the same now. And Frankfurt, the point indeed is that we have to get back to the rule of law. And when the state exercises a monopoly about financing science, about financing the media, about determining healthcare, etc., this leads to abuse. So the roots of what we see now are much deeper. So we have to move the state funding out of science, out of economy, and also out of healthcare and social security. As we mentioned before, people were able to, philosophy exists since 2,500 years, since the ancient Greeks. It's financed by the state. We have the state-funded science for the last 200 years. So we had it 2,000 years before, and it will continue without state funding. We had education without state funding. We had healthcare, social security. People...
We had law without the state, as you said.
We have all without the state, so we don't need the state for that. We need the state for guaranteeing a rule of law, and we need the state, given as geopolitics are, for external defense. But we don't need it to interfere with the internal affairs of people. It must not interfere with the economy, with what you consider fit for your health, with what you think, how you want to educate your children, what science is done. Because, the idea of republicanism was putting this in the hand of the monopoly of the state will guarantee pluralism and keep out private interests. Now, just the opposite is the case, because if you have a private interest and if you're powerful enough, you just hijack the state. As we've seen, if you're an entrepreneur, you want to sell your products, the easiest thing is to convince some politicians that you work for the common good, ESG, the climate regime, it's the same scheme again, then they will bail you out. And the best is that you further people's health or so, and you could do the same with diet. You directly impose your products on the people and you're not liable. So the alternative is we need a strong rule of law, a judicial system where everybody is liable for their actions and can be taken to a court, and the court has to give a fair hearing to all the sides, etc. So a rule of law, but otherwise they are free to do what they want to the extent that we had before rule of law, to respect the freedom of everybody else. And the greatest enemy of the society now is the state monopolizing the economy, monopolizing science, monopolizing the media, because then you don't have the pluralism anymore, and you're not able to form an informed opinion anymore. So I think the corruption of the intellectuals, the corruption of science is even worse than the open corruption of economy when someone claims that their enterprise serves their common good and they have to be bailed out. Because the corruption through science is not so obvious, and through the opinion. Many people believe that it's scientific. So I heard it's interesting, we had local elections here. And somehow someone told some liberals that they should approach me to stand as a local candidate. And they said, well, you call yourself liberal, but you supported all the lockdowns. And they said, well, yes, we know that's against the Constitution, etc. But science told us to do so. And they said, think about for yourself. What is science? How can science tell you this? Did you ever see any real danger? No, but science told us. So they believed in science. So and
maybe, Michael, you should give a philosophy lecture once on the history of science, wearing a T-shirt that says "The science TM made me do it."
Yeah.
Now, Michael, your book will be available, I understand, in English, published also, well, not this time by Achgut, but by someone else.
Yeah, I mean, I'm working on the English version of this book, but I think I should get my thoughts ordered first and then look for a publisher, and it will probably not be mainstream academic.
And in the meantime, I very much recommend that people give a careful, full read to your article, The Illusion of Republicanism, which will be linked, as with the other things we've referred to, in the write-up below this video upload on ukcolumn.org. That was published by the Brownstone Institute. I take it you will continue to write for them as well.
Yes, if they want me, etc. It depends on if I have the time. But I mean, that's the good thing. There are things like the Brownstone Institute, like the Liberal Institute in Switzerland, etc. So we are not isolated. We are not in the Soviet Union, where when you were calling into question communism, you were put into psychiatric isolation because you were obviously a mad person, if you could call, which has been scientifically proven. We are not yet there. We can meet over Zoom, we can associate, and the institutions like Brownstone, the American Institute of Economic Research, with the Great Barrington Declaration, they did a great job. Why? Because when I felt from the beginning there's something going wrong here. Now I had some friends in philosophy, some colleagues who felt the same. But then they said, you're not a medical expert. So how can I know a medical expert who has the same view, who voices criticism? Then, and when the Great Barrington Declaration was published, then I saw Switzerland, unfortunately, no one was among the original signatories, but some Germans were. So I wrote emails to them and say, well, can you help me out, please? I think this is going wrong, but I come under attack because they tell me that I don't understand anything about medicine, and you signed this declaration, so you seem to think that the protection of vulnerable people would be sufficient. So can you help me out? And so this way I met many friends. And then when I spoke out, other people contacted me and said, I think you are right. Can we meet? Can we discuss this? And that way we can associate. So that's the good thing. I mean, I'm optimistic for the future, because this regime will collapse, because people will at some stage, I mean, there's Ayn Rand saying you can ignore reality, but you cannot ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. So we'll see the economic consequences and the intellectual consequences. So, and people feel that those who got vaccinated, there are a lot of people who had adverse effects, and they still got COVID and they still live. And all these unvaccinated people like myself, we are still walking around alive and happily, etc., without health damages. So you see, at some stage, you see that this narrative don't meet reality.
Professor Michael Esfeld, it's been a pleasure to interview you for UK Column, and we wish you all the best fighting your corner in Lausanne, and I expect you're pretty glad that your tenure cannot be revoked so easily.
It can, but it will hopefully not. Yeah. Thank you.